Chapter 5: Why We Lost the Language of Order. Languages disappear long before the realities they describe. This is rarely noticed at first. Words fade quietly, replaced by approximations, metaphors, and borrowed terms. The underlying structures remain, but the capacity to describe them precisely erodes. Order has not vanished from human systems. The language to recognize it has. This chapter examines how that loss occurred and why its consequences are now unavoidable. From observation to explanation. Early human systems developed language through observation. Patterns were noticed repeatedly. Relationships between action and outcome were tracked over time. Stability and collapse were compared. Words emerged to describe what endured and what did not. This language was practical before it was theoretical. It arose from lived experience rather than abstraction. Over time, explanation replaced observation. As systems grew more complex, direct experience gave way to inherited interpretation. People learned what to say before learning what to see. Language became transmissive rather than investigative. This transition was not harmful at first. It allowed knowledge to scale. Eventually, it introduced fragility. The convenience of ready-made language. Inherited language reduces cognitive load. It provides pre-formed categories for understanding events. It assigns meaning quickly. It allows people to respond without re-examining fundamentals. This convenience is efficient. It is also dangerous. When language precedes observation, systems lose sensitivity to deviation. They describe reality according to expectation rather than configuration. Anomalies are dismissed as exceptions rather than signals. The language continues to function. Its reference drift. How ideology replaced description. Ideology offers certainty. It explains outcomes in advance. It assigns cause without examination. It reduces complexity to narrative. This is appealing in unstable environments. The cost is precision. When ideology replaces description, systems stop naming relationships and start defending positions. Language becomes performative rather than diagnostic. Words are used to signal belonging rather than to identify structure. Once this happens, misalignment becomes difficult to articulate. Problems are debated rather than examined. The moralization of structure. One of the most significant shifts in language occurred when structural failure began to be described in moral terms. Collapse became associated with wrongdoing. Stability became associated with virtue. Consequence was interpreted as judgment. This framing provided emotional clarity. It eliminated structural clarity. When systems moralize structure, they personalize failure. They search for fault rather than configuration. They seek correction through punishment rather than recalibration. Moral language simplifies. It also obscures. The rise of procedural substitution. As direct language for order faded, procedures multiplied. Rules were added to compensate for missing understanding. Processes were layered to replace judgment. Compliance became a proxy for coherence. Procedures are necessary. They are not sufficient. When procedures substitute for alignment, systems become rigid. They respond correctly to known conditions and fail catastrophically when conditions change. The more procedures replace understanding, the harder it becomes to recognize misalignment. Measurement without meaning. Modern systems rely heavily on measurement. Metrics offer clarity. They allow comparison. They create feedback loops. They enable optimization. But metrics measure outputs, not relationships. When measurement replaces meaning, systems optimize for indicators rather than coherence. Success is defined numerically while structural health deteriorates invisibly. The system appears to improve. Its capacity to endure declines. The acceleration problem. Speed magnifies language loss. When systems operate faster than reflection, language becomes reactive. Words are selected for immediacy rather than accuracy. Nuance is sacrificed for velocity. This acceleration rewards assertion over examination, confidence over clarity, repetition over understanding. Language becomes thinner as systems become faster. The capacity to name order erodes under pressure to act. Education without orientation. Education transmits knowledge. Orientation requires context. Modern education excels at transferring information. It often neglects the frameworks required to integrate that information into coherent understanding. People learn techniques without principles, skills without limits, authority without responsibility. Without orientation, knowledge fragments. Language becomes technical but not integrative. Sophisticated terms exist without shared understanding of what must remain intact. The fragmentation of disciplines. As systems specialized, language fragmented. Each domain developed its own vocabulary, metrics, and assumptions. Cross-domain understanding diminished. Shared reference points disappeared. Order, which operates across domains, became difficult to describe within any single one. Economics described incentives. Engineering described constraints. Law described authority. Psychology described behavior. Few languages described how these interacted. The whole lost its words. Why success accelerates language loss. Prolonged success weakens language for order. When systems function without immediate consequence, they assume understanding is sufficient. Vocabulary becomes ceremonial rather than functional. Warnings are treated as pessimism. Examination is framed as resistance. Stability is assumed rather than maintained. Success becomes evidence of correctness. Language atrophies under confirmation. When this is ignored. When systems lose language for order, they rely on substitutes. They explain failure through ideology, blame, or belief. They respond to pressure with control rather than recalibration. They mistake activity for coherence. Correction arrives without preparation. The cost of metaphor overuse. Metaphor is useful for communication. It is dangerous when mistaken for description. When metaphors replace analysis, systems lose precision. Structural relationships are obscured by imagery. Cause and effect blur. Metaphor should illuminate structure. It should not replace it. Over-reliance on metaphor weakens the ability to name order directly. Why simplicity is mistaken for clarity. Simple language feels clear. but clarity requires correspondence, not brevity. Oversimplified language collapses distinctions. It groups dissimilar phenomena under single labels. It reduces relational dynamics to slogans. Systems that rely on simplicity struggle to adapt when reality refuses to conform. Clarity does not always feel simple. It feels accurate. The silence that follows language loss. When language fails, silence follows. People sense misalignment but cannot articulate it. Concerns are expressed indirectly. Discomfort manifests as disengagement, frustration, or conflict. Because the problem cannot be named, it cannot be addressed. Silence becomes a signal. Why new language is resisted. Language for order threatens comfort. It exposes limits. It questions narratives. It destabilizes certainty. Systems resist such language not because it is false, but because it is disruptive. It challenges inherited explanations. It requires recalibration rather than defense. Resistance is often framed as disagreement. It is usually avoidance. The role of description in restoration. Restoring language does not restore order by itself. It restores visibility. When relationships can be named, misalignment can be localized. When constraints are articulated, violations can be addressed before enforcement escalates. Language does not prevent failure. It makes correction possible sooner. Closing constitutional statement. Order did not disappear. The language to describe it did. Systems do not fail because they are ignorant of facts. They fail because they lack the words to recognize misalignment before it becomes irreversible. Restoring that language does not guarantee stability. It restores relevance. End of chapter 5.